So this is really just a brief summary of what we talked about last week. And it's really regarding the land of Israel. On the left-hand side, there's the scriptural stuff, and on the right-hand side, the political stuff. So we talked about the land being covenanted by God to Israel as an everlasting possession. We discussed the fact that most Jews were historically exiled, dispersed from the land. However, there has nevertheless been a continuous presence of Jews in the land for over 3,000 years. And that's quite important, because people who will try and pick this apart will argue against that. They will argue against the historical connection of Jews to the land, and you see that in various pronouncements that have been made over the years. For instance, UNESCO talking about the Temple Mount, the site of the two Jewish temples, argued that there really wasn't a Jewish connection, and it was really an Islamic holy site. So crazy as it is, that's where people go. So we've also got a lot of Old Testament prophecies that foretell the restoration of Jews to the land, which can only have started to be fulfilled in the modern era. Remember that the Babylonian and Assyrian exiles were to the north or to the east, certainly not to the south or to the west. But God says he's bringing his people home from the four corners of the earth, from the north, the south, the east, and the west. So this is all evidence of the existence and faithfulness of God. And in Ezekiel 36, he explains why he's doing it. He's doing it for the sake of his holy name. So it's about him, ultimately. On the legal side, political side, the historical connection of Jews to the land and their right to reconstitute their national home was enshrined in international law between 1920 and 1922. We talked about the San Remo Declaration, and we talked about the League of Nations actually embedding that in their resolution. Both of those fall back upon the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and that is word for word incorporated into these subsequent declarations. Britain, of course, was then given the task of facilitating Jewish immigration and progression to statehood, which is effectively Article 6 of the British Mandate for Palestine. However, this is where it all starts to unravel. The British continuously backtracked on their undertakings, and they then finally abandoned the mandate altogether in May 1948. They were going to exit on the 15th of May. However, on the 14th of May, just before Shabbat, between 4 and 4:30 in the afternoon, the independence of the State of Israel was declared by David Ben-Gurion from Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. So that's where we've got to, 14th of May, 1948. What happens after that? Whoops, I need to see if I can click. Following day, there was an Arab invasion. The Secretary General of the Arab League said this will be a war of extermination, and a momentous massacre will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. Let there be no doubt there was one aim, and that was the complete annihilation of the nascent state of Israel. So 5 armies, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, were joined by the Palestinian Arabs living within the mandate, and there was a lot of bloody fighting. In fact, it went on until the following year. After the beginning, troops from Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the Sudan joined those 5 armies. So it was a vast throng of people coming against this newly born state with a bit of a ragtag group of people trying to defend it. However, against all odds, Israel pushed back to survive. And, the question that really needs to be asked here is, how on earth did they manage it? How was it that they could push back the force of all these armies? They did. So 1949, there was a UN brokered armistice. This was not a peace, and the armistice lines are not international boundaries. It's simply where the fighting stopped on that day. And the map on the right of the screen basically outlines what had happened. So you can see that down here on the left, Egypt illegally occupied the Gaza Strip. That's the whole of this bit of territory down there. And Jordan illegally occupied the West Bank. That's the whole of this area, looking a bit like a kidney over on the right. They later actually annexed all of that land to Jordan, and it included the old city of Jerusalem and the Jewish holy sites. So that's literally just over to the right-hand side of that black dot in the middle, which was part of the annexation. One of the things that is not spoken about very much is what happened as a result of all this. There were vast numbers of people who were displaced either at the time or very shortly afterwards. If you look it up, you will find lots of different estimates of the numbers, but it was at least 600,000 Arabs who basically got out of Israel. They got out for a variety of reasons. Obviously, there was the fighting, and some of them just fled from a war zone. Others literally got pushed out as a result of the fighting. Some of them heeded what the leaders of the Arab nations were saying to them who were invading the land. And they basically said, look, we want you to get out. We're going to fight the Jews. The battle's going to be over fairly quickly. And when it is all done, you can move back into the land and you can have your pick. So they were literally encouraged to leave at that time with the expectation that Israel would be destroyed and they could then return. You don't often hear about the 850,000 Jews who lived in Arab lands at that time. And as a result of the conflict, they got pushed out of those lands. I haven't got time to go into all of the detail about that, but there's a woman called Lynn Julius who's written a very comprehensive description of what happened to the Jews at that time. So we've got a refugee crisis, and the question we have to ask around that is, was there resolution or was there perpetuation? So on the 8th of December 1949, UNRA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, was established by the UN. It provided direct relief and works programs for Palestinian refugees. It provided food, housing, education, healthcare, to name the main ones. They basically looked after, in the region of 725,000 people. That's their figures. That's probably why that differs from the 600,000 minimum that I quoted just now. But one of the key things is it was not a resettlement agency. And by 2021, this year, not a single refugee has been resettled. Now, the population of refugees now stands at a total of 5.5 million, because it was not established just to look after those people who were refugees at the time, but all of their offspring. So we're talking about a vast number of people, and we'll look in a moment about what's happened to those people. But I think historically it's important to compare the activities of UNRWA with the activities of the UNRA, which is the United Nations Relief and Resettlement Agency. That was established after World War II on the 9th of November 1943, and it dealt with the 1 million plus people who were basically refugees after the Second World War. By 1952, all of them had been resettled, every single one. So that was an agency also established by the United Nations. On the other side, you've got 850,000 Jews expelled from Arab and Muslim lands. Of these, 580,000 about found permanent homes in Israel. So there are 270,000 roughly remaining. And these people were given permanent nationality in different countries, including Britain, Europe, and the Americas. So these refugees were properly settled, which is what would normally happen as a result of a conflict. And that occurred. In 1948, probably 160,000 Arabs became full Israeli citizens. Citizenship was in fact offered to all Arabs living in the territory at that time. So, moving on. Now briefly looking at Israel and the nations, and just looking at some comparisons. The land mass of Israel is about 1/800th of that occupied by the Arab and Islamic nations, and I'm going to show you a map which depicts that. So you've got one Jewish state at the moment and 22 Arab states, which comprise the League of Nations. Last week we mentioned that really a lot of that all fell out of the resolutions that ensued from 1948 on. The population of Israel is about 9 million. That's actually about the population of Greater London. The Greater London population is probably just under 9.5 million, so it's comparable, give you an idea. Of that, 20% are Arabs and 80% Jews. If you look at the Arab League states, the 22 states, the total population is in the region of 428 million. And of that, 1,000th of 1% are Jews. That's less than 4,000. Just to give you a comparator. So looking at our timeline that we've been moving through, in 1945, the UN was established. The following year, the League of Nations handed over all of its assets and commitments to the UN, which of course included the ratification of the San Remo resolution. That's never been rescinded, therefore it still stands. And 3 years later, in 1949, Israel became the 59th member of the United Nations. So here we've got a map, and the darker green are the countries of the Arab League. The lighter green are the countries of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And then in the middle, you can see the blue country of Israel. So it's almost like this giant pair of nutcrackers. And, you know, the kernel in the middle is the land of Israel. In 1964, the said Arab League created the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And here you see a photograph of Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO. Their charter states that their aim was to liberate Palestine of the Jews, other aims as well, but that was one of them. Included in their charter is a definition of what is meant by Palestinian, and interestingly, it includes all of the progeny. So, you know, that's the same definition taken on board by UNRA. Arafat said regarding the West Bank that there was no longer a claim to it, as it was no longer a part of Palestine. By that, he was meaning that it was under Jordanian occupation from 1948 to 1949. So it's interesting how times change and, goals change. Moving on, next big event in the history of Israel is the 1967 Six-Day War. So the context of this is that right back from 1963, there had been increasing tension between Israel and Jordan in particular over exploitation of water from the River Jordan, which is kind of running all the way down there to the right of the blue, and the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, which is this harp-shaped lake at the top. At the same time, there were things going on in Egypt, and Egyptian troops were moving into this Sinai Peninsula down here in the middle, and they actually pushed out the United Nations Emergency Force, which was a little bit like a kind of peacekeeping force down there in the Sinai. So this was sending a lot of alarm signals into Israel. And then finally, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Now, if like me, some time ago, I was wondering where on earth Tiran is. It's actually down here at the bottom. I don't know if you can see that where my pointer is. At the bottom of the Gulf of Arat, which is this inlet there. And Egypt closed that off. They blocked it to Israeli shipping. And that was regarded in international terms as a casus belli, as an occasion for war. But there are other things going on as well. And Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon were also moving their forces towards the border. You've got Lebanon at the top there. You've got Jordan here. You've got Iraq coming in from the east. Down at the bottom, you've got Syria moving up. And of course, Egypt had already moved across to the border, but also down here to Tehran, where they were blocking the straits. So 6 days of war, you would wonder how Israel could survive. What actually happened was that Israel made a preemptive strike acting in self-defense against the Egyptian Air Force and virtually completely obliterated it. They managed to recapture the areas that had been taken by both Jordan, i.e. this area here, what we call the West Bank today, and the Gaza Strip down here from Egypt. They also made inroads into Syria, taking the Golan Heights. Remember, that was originally part of the British Mandate back in 1920. But interestingly, the British, I think I mentioned last week, handed it over to France to administer as part of the Syrian mandate. They kind of washed their hands of it. Anyway, Israel's got it back after this war. And they also occupy the whole of the Sinai Peninsula, the area in light blue at the bottom. Now, all of that was completely taken. They annexed East Jerusalem with the holy sites, but interestingly, they didn't at that time annex the West Bank. They simply kept a military presence there. I mentioned the Sinai Heights. So internationally, what happened after the Six-Day War? The United Nations passed Resolution 242, which is often spoken about. You've probably heard a lot about that. UN resolutions made by the General Assembly are not binding. They're intended to provide a framework for a negotiated settlement. So what was being worked towards was, in quotes, a peaceful and accepted settlement, the termination of all claims or states of belligerency, the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. That's the direct quote. Interestingly, the extent of that withdrawal isn't defined. Lord Caradon, who was the British official who actually drafted this resolution, said immediately afterwards, and I quote him, "It would have been wrong to demand that Israel return to its positions of June 4, 1967, because those positions were undesirable and artificial." June 4 was the beginning of the war, which ended on June 10, so that's the 6 days. It said that there should be a right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. And if you look at the map today, Israel has today already withdrawn from 94% of the territories concerned. And then obviously navigation was to be guaranteed, so no more blockades of the Straits of Tiran. So how did the Arabs respond to this? They had a summit in Khartoum later on in 1967, and they came out from that with what are called the 3 no's: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation. So at that time, there's complete intransigence. And interestingly, it was later on that peace treaties arose. We'll come on to that in a moment, but with Egypt, first of all, in 1979, opposed by all other members of the Arab League, interestingly, and then Jordan subsequently, but only in 1994. So the key thing for Israel out of all of this is that Jerusalem was reunified. On the right, you can see an outline of the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. General Mordecai Ger, who was part of the forces that entered the old city, has said, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." I repeat, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Like me, you may have heard recordings of those very words on clips of film. Note what it says in Luke 21, verse 24b, "Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." There are people who argue that when Jerusalem came back under Israeli control, that indeed the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. However, there is one significant fact, and that is that shortly after the war, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, actually handed back control of the Temple Mount to officials of the Muslim Waqf, who still administer it. It's a Jordanian outfit. They still administer the Temple Mount today. So arguably it's still being trampled on by non-Jews. Next onslaught against Egypt was the Yom Kippur War, which took place in 1973. It completely took Israel unawares. It was a surprise attack by armies of Israel, of Egypt, Syria, and it took place on the holiest night of the Jewish year in 1973. It was on the 6th of October. But there was a counterattack from Israel, obviously, in self-defense, and fascinatingly, that extended deep into both Egypt and Syria. In fact, both readily accepted the offer of ceasefire. I think they were seriously worried about how far that counterattack might have gone. Israel lost just over 2,500 soldiers, and following on from that, signed separation of forces agreements with both Egypt and with Syria. The United Nations deployed a disengagement observer force which supervised the implementation of that separation, and there was actually a gradual withdrawal to predefined lines within the Sinai by Israel as they completely pulled back. The agreement with Egypt was superseded by an Egypt-Israel peace treaty in 1979, signed with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, as a result of which Israel withdrew completely from the Sinai Peninsula, and that was then demilitarized. Egypt came under a lot of stick from other members of the Arab League as a result of that peace agreement. And this is basically a timeline of not all events. I mean, it's really bare bones between 1973 and 2021, just trying to bring things up to date. The thing that people will remember from 1973 is the Arab oil embargo that targeted countries seen as supportive of Israel in the war. I remember at that time, the UK petrol price literally doubling overnight. It went from 36 to 72 pence per litre, or gallon, I think it was then, but it was absolutely huge. 79, we mentioned the peace treaty with Egypt. So that paid the price. He committed, as it were, the unforgivable sin. 1980, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, declared Jerusalem the undivided capital of Israel. And interestingly, as a result of that, 13 embassies relocated from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. In 1980 also, the ICJ, the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem, was founded, really where a group of Christians said, look, everybody's deserting you, we're actually going to stand with you, and they're still physically based in Jerusalem. 2 years later, there was a spate of aggression from the PLO, which led against Israel, which led to the first Lebanon War. At the time, the PLO was based physically in Lebanon, having been pushed out of Jordan. Then 5 years later, the first Intifada by Palestinians, where Israelis were attacked. I mean, not military targets, just citizens indiscriminately. 1993 was when the Oslo Accords were signed by Israel and the PLO. That was following the Camp David talks. Following year, there was actually a peace treaty with Jordan. Then the year after that, there was the second follow-up to Oslo, Oslo II, which created West Bank areas A, B, and C, which we'll go into and I'll show you on a map soon. 2000, the PLO leader Arafat rejected the Israeli peace proposal and launched the second Intifada with suicide bombings and other attacks. I put that in red because that was, I think, the third or fourth, however you're counting, rejection of the possibility of a Palestinian state. 2005, Israel evacuated all Jews from Gaza. It was a unilateral withdrawal. Ariel Sharon, the prime minister at the time, implemented that. There were around 9,000 Jews who were evacuated. And of course, it was in hope of peace. But over the next 2 years, so more than 2,700 rockets launched towards Israel. So on the peace front, it really didn't achieve what was anticipated. Following year, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. And of course, that was really quite significant in terms of a change of regime. Following year, they seized control of Gaza in a violent coup, and rocket fire against Israel, which had commenced in 2001, actually intensified. Same year, Hezbollah from the north launched a series of rocket attacks from Lebanon, and that effectively led to the Second Lebanon War. I'm going to show you a couple of maps just so you get an idea of the reach of some of these rockets. The following year, 2008, Israel offered Palestinians almost 100% of the West Bank and Gaza in return for peace, but that was rejected. So in modern times, recent times, that was the second rejection of a Palestinian state. That was followed by Operation Cast Lead, the aim of which was to reestablish or actually eliminate the rocket fire. Wasn't entirely successful. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense was when the Iron Dome was inaugurated. That's been incredibly effective in shooting down rockets aimed towards Israel. It doesn't intercept them all. It only aims to intercept the ones that they think are going to do the worst damage. So obviously a lot get through. And I mean, the other thing that happens, a lot actually fall on territory within the Gaza Strip. That's another issue. 2 years later, Operation Protective Edge, more than 4,500 rockets were fired towards Israel at that time. Following year, there was a wave of Arab violence, which led to the fear of a third intifada. It didn't quite happen, but it was heading in that direction. Between 2018 and 2020, you'll remember all the arson attacks from Gaza with the incendiary balloons coming across. In 2018 alone, there were more than 2,000 fires, which together caused destruction of nearly 8,500 acres of farmland and forest. And that's been a continual theme. I mean, you may have read in the news fairly recently that there have been even more incendiary devices sent over the last few weeks. And then the Operation Guarding the Wall, which lasted 11 days, has recently occurred. 4,400 rockets, minimum, maybe more, fired from Gaza at that time. So there's been anything but peace over all of these years. Just so that you get the feel of the rocket fire from Gaza, this map shows the reach of different types, different grades of rocket. The light yellow being one grade, just reaching out to Beersheba in the south there, not quite up to Rishon LeZion, but Ashdod, Ashkelon as well. Then the second layer is the orange, which reaches Jerusalem, and Dimona, which is where the Israeli nuclear reactor is based. And then the red goes right up to the north as far as Haifa, and not quite as far down as Eilat in the south. From Lebanon, you can see that the rocket fire can reach past Beersheba in the south. So it covers all the main areas of population within Israel. And it's notable that Hezbollah has an estimated stockpile of at least 150,000 rockets supplied by Iran. I mean, interestingly, I haven't really mentioned Iran and don't in the whole of this presentation, but that's really, you know, if Hezbollah and Hamas are the puppets, then the puppet masters are the mullahs of Iran. Between 1920 and 2020, I think one of the most significant developments is that warfare, armed conflict, has morphed into what is called by some people lawfare, the use of the United Nations and legislation, international law, to target Israel. So 1920, the Jewish national home was going to be in Palestine. I mean, that was basically the Balfour Declaration. Let's create a Jewish national home in Palestine. And provision was made for the close settlement in Palestine by Jews. Of course, initially, Palestine was the whole of the British Mandate, not just the 23%, which is now Israel. So there's going to be a reconstitution of the Jewish homeland in Judea and Samaria, what's currently referred to as the West Bank. The Jewish homeland has rights to secure borders, and of course there was going to be protection of human rights of minority groups. 2020, this is mainly coming out of The Hague. The national home in Palestine is going to be a non-Jewish one. Israeli settlements in Palestine are deemed illegal. As we mentioned earlier, UNESCO, etc., the Jewish homeland never existed in Judea and Samaria. It was Palestinian land. Jews have no right to self-defense against terror, and there is no protection of minorities in Palestine. We're talking obviously about Jewish minorities living in that territory. So there's been a huge shift over a century where the majority of national opinion has moved from being really supportive to a Jewish presence and a Jewish homeland to being antagonistic towards the Jewish presence in the Jewish homeland and supportive to an Arab Palestinian homeland within the area. So what is it that drives all of this? Well, quite honestly, I think a lot of it is a numbers game. And if you look at the math, you find out very quickly what's going on. There are 193 nations that constitute the United Nations, and most voting simply requires a majority, which is 97 nations. But for issues deemed to be of great import, then a 2/3 majority is required, and a 2/3 majority of 193 is 129. So within the United Nations, there are a number of constituent blocks, and those blocks very often, not invariably, very often vote together. So of these, you've got the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which consists of 57 nations, and their commitment is to liberate Jerusalem. That's what they status, one of their aims. Then you've got this huge G77. Well, that's what it started out as, 77 nations, now 134. On the right, I mean, I know it's difficult to pick out, but it's number one, which is the big square, and those are the 134 nations. They have recognized Palestine as an Arab entity since 1976. But in 2019, that particular group was chaired by Palestine. Now, this is very interesting because Palestine is not a member state of the United Nations. Since I think it was 2012, they were given observer status within the United Nations, but observer states are empowered to chair constituent blocks, and that's one of the things that happened. Obviously, you've got the EU and the Western nations as part of one of these blocks, and they're proponents of a two-state solution after 1973. There's a large African group, and there's a large Russian group, both of which contain a number of Muslim nations who would be kind of antagonistic to the Jewish state in one way or another. So it's not difficult to see how numbers can come together to pass resolutions that are anti-Israel, and that's actually been quite a lot of the history.
Yeah, this was basically the slide of the constituent blocks of the UN. So moving on, some of the institutions of the UN are the UN Human Rights Council, which was established 2006, and it replaced the then discredited United Nations Council, I think, for Human Rights, which was established in 1946. Significant thing about the UN HRC is that it has a standing agenda item 7, which is, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So of all of the trouble spots in the world, Israel is effectively singled out for continuous attention, and some of the worst human rights offenders internationally comparatively get little or no attention. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which I mentioned already, established in 1949, sadly perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem rather than solve it. The International Court of Justice was established in 1945, and that's made, it basically makes advisory opinions rather than anything else. And in 2004, it said regarding the wall, which is kind of a fence for the vast majority of it, but nevertheless, it says construction of the wall and its associated regime cannot be justified by military exigencies or by the requirements of national security or public order. And it is said that the wall was effectively contrary to international law. Sadly, if you look at the numbers of suicide bombings that took place before the wall and after the wall, the facts actually totally counter that assertion. Then you've got the International Criminal Court, which was established 2002. Since 2012, it has had a Muslim chief prosecutor, that's Fatima Bensouda, and a lot of people think that she is anti-Semitic. And interestingly, she this year is due to be replaced by a Brit, Karim Khan, who is also a Muslim, and he's going to come into post as chief prosecutor of the ICC. One of the problems is that the International Criminal Court is currently investigating the 2014 Israel-Hamas conflict. There are two anomalies about this. The first is that Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court. Second, the PA, which is effectively brought this action, is not a UN member state. So on both of those counts, there's something really quite anomalous about this situation. So we'll see how it develops, but arguably it should never have happened. Then you've got, this is just an interesting one, the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which was established in 1975. No other state has its own UN committee, no other people group has its own UN committee. So this is really quite extraordinary. There are other institutions of the UN. This is really just meant to be, a bare bones look at some of them. So now, I just wanted to say something quickly about Gaza, because the two geographical areas that are in the news today are Gaza and the West Bank. So in 2005, as I mentioned, Ariel Sharon made a unilateral withdrawal. 21 Jewish settlements in total were evacuated. That's all these sort of round blue dots that are kind of spread across the area. 8,500, probably 9,000 people were uprooted. That's less than 1% of the total population of Gaza at the time. About 160 farmers or more were evacuated, and as a result, about 5,000 Arab workers lost their livelihoods virtually overnight. Down in Gush Katif, that's this kind of southern bit where I'm pointing, were a number of glass houses which grew produce for export. They'd previously grossed about $200 million per year in export revenue. So it just gives you some sense of what actually happened here. The actual cost of evacuation, the financial cost of evacuation, was about $2 billion, which at the time, 2005, was 3.5% of the whole state budget. So really it's vast. And Gaza became Juden Rein, that means cleansed of Jews. And the Arab population at the time was about 1 million. So what about 2021? Well, Gaza now is controlled by Hamas, which is the terrorist organization with a charter to destroy Israel. The Arab population has doubled, you can see, in 15 years, 16 years, to about 2 million now. Of that 2 million, 77% are urbanized. So the largest central population is here in the North Gaza City. It's very close, very densely populated. The median age of population in Gaza is 18 years, and there are 65% of people below the age of 25, so it's an overwhelmingly young population. Gaza has got about 750,000 population up there in the north. One of the things that is very interesting, whoops, I flicked out and I need to flick back, are these grey areas. There's a little grey area there, 2 by the coast, a few in the middle, one just off Khan Yunis and one right down in the south, those are UN designated refugee camps. So it's very interesting. I mean, it's like giving the Welsh control of Wales and setting up refugee camps for Welsh people in the territory. It's the equivalent. I mean, why they're there is really, I think, quite remarkable. Moving on, the constitution of the West Bank. This is this whole kidney-shaped area. The Arab population is about 2 million, the Jewish population about 475,000. More than 95% of the Palestinian population lives on 40% of the land. That's areas designated A and B. A is in black. These are the large Palestinian cities in the West Bank. As you see, Nablus, Jericho, Ramallah, Bethlehem, and Hebron. Then there's Tulkarm and Qalqilia right up there at the top. And then the grey shaded areas are the stripy areas of the Palestinian villages. And the rest, the light grey area is area C, which is 60% of the landmass, on which are a number of Jewish settlements, which are these blue triangles. And they cover about less actually than 1.7% of the land. Then right at the heart of the West Bank, you've got the area of East Jerusalem. Looking at Jerusalem as a total municipality, you've got the division between East and West. This is the 1949, the green armistice line, which kind of runs down right through. So if you look at West Jerusalem, the blue area on the left, there are about 350,000 Jews who comprise 99% of the population. About 3,500 Arabs live in West Jerusalem. Then in East Jerusalem, you've got about 350,000 Arabs, which comprise about 61% of the population, and then 39% Jews, or 220,000. The Palestinian populated areas are in orangey brown, and the Jewish populated areas are in blue. So as you can see, it's a bit of a patchwork. But what I consider to be the real issue is the old city of Jerusalem. Here we have a map of Jerusalem. You can see the Jewish quarter in yellow down at the bottom right. Here you've got the Temple Mount complex. So it's the site of the first and second temples, the holiest place in Judaism, the place where God has put his name. Read in 1 Kings 8, verse 29, the place to which Jesus will return, Acts 1:11 and Zechariah 14:4, and the place from which Jesus will rule the nations, Zechariah 14:7. So it is highly, highly religiously significant. So here we've got, have I missed one out? Yeah, I missed one out. Right. This is really asking the question about Palestinian statehood. This is just another map which shows the different areas. This is kind of slightly better colored than the previous one, so it's easier to kind of pick them out. But interestingly, as I mentioned last week, the UN does not form states. People groups form states, and there are three recognized requisite criteria for the development of state in international law. The first is that there is a recognized territory. So we know that the Palestinian territory is subject to final status negotiations. That's what has come out of the Oslo Accords. That still hasn't been finalized. Those negotiations haven't taken place. So at best, that's a disputed entity. It's not a resolved entity. As we said, the 1949 armistice lines are not international boundaries. And you'll hear people talking about the 1967 ceasefire lines, which are basically the same as the armistice lines. And, that's not finally been resolved. Second, you've got to have an effective government. If you look at the Palestinian Authority, you see that it's completely riddled with corruption. Arafat was one of the richest people in the world, with money secreted away in Swiss bank accounts. And we can ask questions about Mahmoud Abbas. Also, there's very good evidence, only some relatively recently, about the repression and brutalism that is practiced by the PA. Someone recently died in custody, and there was a whole issue about that. They'd been very severely beaten. So dissenters are not really tolerated. I personally spoke to an Arab Palestinian who basically was a Christian who, having spent time in the Bible, recognized God's love for the Jewish people, recognized the legitimacy of the state of Israel, and whose family were then threatened by members of the PA with extinction. They would have been killed if she carried on talking about the things that she did in public. Then there's the adoption of UN values and principles. Obviously, one is democracy. And you have to ask the question, how much of this is rule of the people by the people, and how much of it is repression by leaders. Also, safeguarding of minorities. And there is not a great track record of that either in the PA-administered areas. And that's not even starting to look at Gaza, which is ruled by Hamas. So moving on, the question that I really want to look at the end, we're coming into land, is what's the difference between Satan's agenda and God's agenda? Because we can look at the political, but actually I don't think this is going to be resolved by human beings. So Satan's agenda is to block the return of Messiah. The Golden Gate, which is the Eastern Gate in Jerusalem, is the gate by which the scriptures point to the return of the Messiah. Interestingly, it was basically Saladin who first blocked the Eastern Gate, literally bricked it up in order to prevent the return of the Jewish Messiah. The wall was subsequently rebuilt in the Middle Ages, and it was Suleiman who made sure that the Eastern Gate was blocked up at that time. In front of the gate's an Arab cemetery, and no self-respecting Jew would walk over dead bodies. So there would be no Jews to welcome the Messiah on his return, none to say the words, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Satan's agenda is that there will be a rule of Antichrist, as described in Revelation 13. And if you look at Islamic belief, then certainly the Shias believe in the existence of, or the return of, the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, who will arise at a time of great conflict. And they believe that the Mahdi lives in what they call the occultation, i.e. he's kind of around but hidden, but will be revealed at the appropriate time. So that's one of the reasons why Shias want to promote conflict, because they think they'll hasten the return of the 12th Imam. So it's going to be a time of domination and destruction according to Satan's agenda, ultimately resulting in death, because Jesus is the Prince of Life. Satan comes to steal and kill and destroy. What's God's agenda then? It's the return of Messiah and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. It's centered on Israel. Within Israel, it's centered on Jerusalem. Within Jerusalem, it's centered on the Temple Mount. And on the Temple Mount, it is centered on the act of worship. So the ultimate question is, who is going to be worshipped on the Temple Mount? God's agenda is also the highway of blessing. Remember, that's described in Isaiah 19, where the word says there's going to be a highway of blessing between Egypt and Assyria. And it says that God refers to Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. So that's God's agenda. What also is God's agenda is the one new man in Christ that's described in Ephesians 2, where the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and non-Jew is broken down, and that all are genuinely one in Christ Jesus. So it's an agenda of life. That's just a picture of the Golden Gate facing east, and you can probably just about start to pick up some tombstones in the foreground of that. And here we have it, the centerpiece of everything, the Temple Mount. You can see that it is an absolutely huge plaza dominated by the Dome of the Rock, which is actually not a mosque. It's a monument in the center of which is a rock. Interestingly, the question is begged, was that the rock where Abraham set out to sacrifice Isaac, Mount Moriah? But it's also the threshing floor of Araunah, the place that David actually bought as in order to establish an altar when he interceded with God for the angels of destruction to stay their hand and not destroy Jerusalem. So very, very interesting. Moving on. What I hope I presented is that there are antithetical, there are opposing narratives regarding Israel. On the one hand, you've got those who say that Israel has no divine right to the land. They espouse a theology that favors the Palestinians. It comes out of a sense of the victimhood of the Palestinians. They're an oppressed people. There is then the application of liberation theology that was developed in the South America area. And this then leads on to what has been described as a Christian Palestinianism, whereby there's a whole theology about, the importance of adopting that particular cause. So Israel is seen as a colonial power. The state is seen as an apartheid state. Israel is an aggressor. Israel is white. And Israel is illegitimate. So you've got this whole constellation of characteristics that one side will use as a lens through which to view everything that happens in the Middle East. On the other side, you have the narrative that basically says God has given the land to Israel as an everlasting possession, the key word there being everlasting, that the covenant is unconditional and is eternal. You have around that the theology of Israel as being a light to the nations. Obviously, the supreme light within Israel is the Messiah, but nevertheless, Israel is still a source of good and of benefit to the nations in the world. At the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel, there was a publication called 70 for 70. And in this publication, 70 achievements to come out of the nation of Israel and from the Jewish people were listed, and they are absolutely mind-boggling. Advances in technology, in medicine, right across the board. So this view would also say that settlements are legal in international law. It would point to Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel. I'm not talking about the territories, I'm talking about the state of Israel that is Israeli governed. Jews and Arabs have equal rights. The IDF has been described by Colonel Richard Kemp, the colonel who led the British forces in Afghanistan, as, quote, the most moral army in the world, that they go to lengths that no other army would. Against the white is that actually most Israeli Jews are from the Levant, are from the Middle East. They're not from Europe. And it would point to Israel's legitimacy, both biblically and in international law. So the question is life or death. I've just pointed here to Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 to 20, the key bit of which is, so choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. Remember, the land was given by God to the Jewish people. He didn't say that if they offended, they'd have the land taken away. He said the land would spew them out. And actually, you can see how over history that has happened. Instead of being in the place of blessing, they come into the place of cursing. And then finally, what is God's solution? I believe it's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, where God says, behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I'll make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them and on their heart. I will write it. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more. That's not an act of man, that's an act of God. That's the act that brings about transformation. And ultimately, it's only God's transformation, I believe, the return of Messiah Jesus to the earth, that will actually put a stop to war.